Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of In the Barn. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey, and in today's episode, we are going to tackle part 2 of the bit versus bitless debate. We are going to dive into the life and research of the man himself, Mr. Dr. Robert Cook. Who is Dr. Cook, and why is he so passionate about eliminating the use of the bit? If you haven't already, you should check out our last episode, and all I'm going to say is the laser beams. Maybe we talk about sharks with freaking laser beams on their head, or maybe it's something else, but go check it out to find out what laser beams have to do with your horse's attention span. And of course, do not forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review on the old Apple Podcast app. We really appreciate those stars. We are trying to collect them all like Pokemon or Mario Kart coins. So go ahead, help us out with those stars. And thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. So I do want to give a quick apology for last week's episode. New year, new us does mean we're going to be organized and get episodes out on time. Unfortunately, there was a big storm where I live and I was out of power for Tuesday through Friday, which meant I couldn't do my research because I usually do research during the week before I go to my full-time job. And by the time we got around to recording, it was Monday, and the episode was supposed to come out on Thursday. And the information I had was amazing. I did a beautiful job of just sharing the story. And then I let Robin talk, and it turned out she had researched something we'd already talked about. And we just figured it was going to be too much of a challenge to try to get an episode recorded and edited before the Thursday. So our apologies. What I did was beautiful and fantastic, and it was Robin.
I'm sorry.
So oops. But we decided to make it up to you by bringing you part 2 of the bit versus bitless debate, and I think we are going to do part 3 next week. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this topic. To make sure we give this topic sort of an in-depth look, one of the ways we have to do that is by talking about Robert Cook, Dr. Robert Cook, the manufacturer of the famous Dr. Cook's bridle cross-under thingy-mabobber.
Yeah, his is a little confusing, how it operates.
I think, honestly, the feedback I'm seeing is those who use it like it. So, I mean, I don't know if we want to hide it till the end or just get it out from the jump, but we're not huge fans of Dr. Robert Cook. We'll explain why. I have no issue with the bridle, but after all my research, I will never buy one because what a journey. What a journey.
Well, and I think, honestly, this episode is such an important part of this discussion because Robert Cook is so well known. I mean, he's infamous in the world, or anything revolving around bitless. He is a household name around. I mean, everyone knows that, constantly references him, constantly refers back to him, talks about his leading discoveries in this field, how he's referenced things, and he's been a trailblazer in bitless stuff. And so I think it's so important that we actually go and look through all his research and what it actually is.
I think at the end of the day, he sort of got, he kind of got fixated on the bitlessness and trying to prove that he was right, that he kind of missed a lot of other stuff that was happening, and everything just became very too narrow in how he was looking at it. So with that, let's start with who is he? So I actually had to do a lot of digging trying to find a biography on him that was somewhat informative. I just saw the same paragraph copied and pasted everywhere, including his website. But I did actually finally find a biography that he himself wrote, and so I'll share that. But Robert Cook, he is the acronym at the end of his name is FRCVS PhD. I don't know what FRCVS stands for, but I know it means, I know what it means. So he is a surgeon from the Royal College of Veterinary and Science. I just don't know what the F means.
Maybe if it's for fun. F is for fun. We do stuff together, you and me.
And me. I don't know that that's what it is, but it could be. Huh. So he is a professor of surgery emeritus of Tufts University, Massachusetts. So Guys, I can't pronounce stuff. Emeritus.
We'll believe you either way.
It means that even though he's retired, he gets to retain that title. He will always be able to call himself a professor of surgery, even though he already is retired and is no longer professor. He gets to, like, in honor of reputation and his service, he gets to keep that title. And that's like the highest title he's ever received. He graduated from the Royal Veterinary College in London in 1952. I'm like 99% sure he's British and just lived in the US for a while. But there's like nothing about his childhood. The most I could find about his childhood was he worked on a dairy farm for a year when he was 16, and then the following year worked at a riding stables. That's like the most I could find about his childhood. I'm pretty sure he was born in 1930 or 1931. He says he was born in 1930 in one of the studies. Like, that's where I found the bit about the dairy farm and riding stable, is he was like talking about him and this horse that were both born in the 30s. Anyways, he is a surgeon. Most of his time has been spent as a professor. Very little of his time has been spent as he's not a veterinarian. He's not a DVM. He did not spend a lot of time in practice, just spent a little bit of time in practice. So his bio that I found is he was actually inducted into the Faculty Hall of Fame at Tufts University. So part of their, I don't know what a Faculty Hall of Fame is, but...
That sounds like a Hall of Fame for the faculty.
That is one guess, and I think it could be correct. But yeah, he's just like a generic looking white dude. You would not recognize this man on the street. That is not an insult. That is just like a statement. Like, you wouldn't recognize him. He's just a white dude with, like, I don't know, he looks like a grandpa. He's just a grandpa. I mean, at some point he wasn't a grandpa and looked not like a grandpa, but now he looks like a grandpa. So as a novice graduate, this is him speaking, and I'm going to read, like, his words. So not when it says I, it's not me, it's him. Okay. As a novice graduate, I spent 3 years in mixed practice and another 3 in horse practice. So yeah, he did do cats and dogs at the very beginning. This was followed by a year of continuing education as house surgeon at the freshly minted Cambridge University Vet School, enabling me to get a toehold in academia a year later as a member of the faculty at my old college, by this time a part of London University. During 5 years there, I developed a research interest in diseases of equine ear, nose, and throat, and pioneered, before the age of tranquilizers, the daily use of a metal endoscope with glass optics on the fully conscious horse. I have seen drawings of this. That is a very brave man that stuck a very long metal tube up a horse's nose. I'm just throwing that out there. No tranquilizers, that poor animal, and wow. Another 5 years followed at the Glasgow Vet School, during which time I was seconded to Kenya for a magical year with my wife, Margaret. This is the only time I've ever seen him reference a family. Margaret and our 3 boys, so he has 3 sons, and they helped staff the new vet school at Nairobi University. In 1977, the phone rang, and I was invited to put my name forward for a job at Illinois University Vet School. Thinking this might provide an interesting experience for a few years before returning to the UK, I agreed and was appointed. When I arrived at North Grafton in 1979, the campus was an abandoned state mental hospital that had been closed down many years. It was sold to Tufts University for $1. I was the only member of the faculty at Grafton, and the V84 class of students was due to arrive at the Boston campus the following year. Margaret and I lived on campus in a rapidly restored house that is now the department office. Incredibly, by the time the final year students arrived at Grafton, we had a fully complement of faculty on board and a functioning large animal hospital, the Amelia Peabody Pavilion. I served as acting dean in 81 and 82. These were interesting but rewarding times. In 1997, I was introduced to and subsequently developed an unfamiliar design of bitless bridle that traced its history back to the rodeo circuit of the 1950s and probably earlier. By researching and documenting the harmful effects of the bit for the horse and rider and the benefits of the new bridle, I have been able to broadcast the good news worldwide, making a single?
Single.
I think he meant single. He wrote signal contribution to the natural horsemanship revolution by initiating a correction to a Bronze Age mistake, which he loves saying. So that's just like a little blurb that he himself wrote in order to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. But basically, he's just been a professor his entire time. And I think that's something important to note, because being a professor, you really, like, and veterinary school is different. Like, I do know that you are constantly seeing horses coming into your practice, but it's not the same as being an on-call vet that is, like, in the field. As a professor, there's just, I feel like there's sometimes a little bit of isolation from what else is going on, and a little bit sometimes, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for right now, but this is something, it's all like theoretical. Theoretical is the word I'm looking for. It's a lot of theoretical discussions that you, hypothesis that you have, and I would think that since most of the research we reference that comes from universities or supported by universities, that we would see less theory from Mr. Robert Cook, but that's just like not the case when we talk about his research, in quotes. He does have a couple books. One of them you can buy on Amazon. It's called, well, you can buy both of them on Amazon. Metal in the Mouth, The Abusive Effects of Bitted Bridles is steal of a deal right now on Amazon for $961.
Oh my God. How many pages is it?
It's, I don't know, it's like however many pages make a book.
Okay, that number drastically ranges.
However, his other book is from 1989, and it is the specifications for speed in the racehorse, the airflow factors, and that's only $14.44 on Amazon. So, and it has really great reviews. So I don't know why those have such a difference. I'm thinking one of those has a few more printed copies than the other. But so those are books that he's written, but he's done. Well, I sent you a 22-page bibliography that he had compiled. A big section of that was not stuff that he had written, but stuff that had favorably referenced his work. But, like, there was a lot on there. So he did start in 1962, and one of the first things that he published was clinical observations of the equine soft palate. So he has a lot of published clinical observations. I will lump those into a research category because clinical observations are super important. That's how we need those to be able to learn and understand how these things, you know, how diseases impact horses and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, like, clinical observations is good, hard science. And that's what he was doing for much of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It wasn't until the 90s that those were not stopped sort of being the case. So, like, his main focus really in the beginning, so like he said in his biography, he is ears, eyes, nose, throat. He's really like the mouth doctor. And I don't think we can take anything away from his contributions to that field at that time. So he did a lot of research into pulmonary hemorrhaging in horses, what causes bleeding, identifying that bleeding was coming from the lungs, not the throat or the nose in racehorses. He did a lot of work looking at things like guttural pouches, soft palate damage, roaring, and trapped epiglottises, all things that really affect the thoroughbred racehorse a lot. He did do a lot of research via clinical observations and like diagnosis, trying to figure out what was going on with these horses, what were the diseases and ailments that were affecting their mouths and throats. One of the other ones that I'll talk about in a second is head shaking. He did do a lot of research on these topics and really for such a long time was the foremost expert on a lot of these issues. You know, we've had a lot more research come into the field, and so he's not the leading expert as he used to be, and that just happens, right? He's like in his 80s. But for a big chunk of time, he was the leading expert. And then as he got a little bit into the 90s, that's when he started exploring this idea of bitlessness, and you'll see a lot of his research 90s onward is it's not really research. It's not, some of it is clinical observations, but a lot of it is just letters to the editor. So while they are being published in scientific journals, they're actually just letters to the editor.
I myself was so shocked and surprised by that because you constantly hear his works, hear it referenced all the freaking time, and we always imagine him, or at least I've always heard him referred to as like a trailblazer in this scientific research and the studies behind bitless and bit effects and how they compare to one another and how much better bitless is than bits. And I've always thought that like he had 20 or something studies he specifically had done and conducted to that he was like constantly referring to and writing about. And I was so surprised when I found out a lot of them were articles and letters, which, you know, is important all on its own, but it felt like I was being misled up until this point, you know?
Yeah, I think what I really expected was to read his experiments, that this was the experiment he set up. This was the control group. This was the, you know, group that had these were the variables we were testing. This is what we changed, and set it up in such a way that someone else could easily duplicate it. And that is really not what happens with that's just not what it is. A lot of it is just him making a claim, and you will find others who have set up experiments to try to like disprove or confirm his hypothesis or his theory, but it's just a lot of theories that he throws out there and very strongly believes that the answer is, ride in a bitless bridle, take your horseshoes off, and ride in a treeless saddle. Horseshoes and treeless saddles are not really the wheelhouse of an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And it doesn't mean everything he says is wrong. I think it's one of those, like, he's going to be right some of the time. Like, really frustrating. Is that, like, yeah, some of the time you are going to be right. Some of the time it is going to be the bit that's causing the problem. But some of the time that's just not the case. And he has a lot of surveys. He did do tons of surveys. And I've looked at them a little bit, but not in depth. And it's just, he doesn't really have a concrete setup for, okay, so we took the bit out, we put the bitless on. These are like the marks we're looking for. This is like,
yeah.
And I know the survey has some of that where he does say, how many times did the horse do this? How many times did the horse do that? But it's all coming from the individual. It's not coming from an outside observer. It's all coming from the horse owner who is documenting this. And a lot of it, instead of coming from like an actual experiment that's set up, and here are the parameters, and here's the before and here's the after.
Right. That's actually something I got super frustrated with, because he kept referencing that the total numbers of problems caused by the bit exceeds like 150. And he would say these like alarming numbers of these are so many issues caused by the bit, that there's over 100 issues and problems caused by the bit. But when you look into how he came about these 100 different issues, it was from a questionnaire that was sent out, and people that responded that used his bridle and used the bitless, and they specifically listed or said what differences they saw in their own horses. Like, I fear that some of those were a placebo effect or very subjective, and I don't know if you necessarily can like take what someone responded in an open-ended survey and say, look, now we have 10 more issues that are caused by the bit.
Yeah, and without an actual scientific observer there, for like lack of a better term, like, how did you conclude that those were effects of the bit? The survey is great. I think a survey is a wonderful way to start. I just think there needed to be some more parameters around it. There's been a few other experiments where he's done, there's one with like 4 horses that he did. I think I've previously mentioned this, where they were with a bit, and then they had the bitless go on.
Oh, yeah.
And they videoed that and like talked about it. But like, you have to actually go and like request the video from him. It's no longer like publicly available. I did find the study, but I like, for my research this week, I really focused on head shaking, and because he was, for such a long time, he was the leader in head shaking, and like what that disease was. That's something he looked into starting in the 70s. And that was the first time, not in the 70s, but later in the 90s, head shaking was the first time he said, wait, like, that's the first time I saw bitless come up in conversation, was in connection with head shaking.
Yeah, I mostly just looked into his couple different articles that looked at bit-induced fear and like welfare problem and safety hazard for horse and rider. And I was mainly looking through that, in which it's an article where he's writing about the surveys that he's taken, the responses that he's gotten. And because I know he's a very big proponent on like bit-induced fear. And so I thought that was a pretty important aspect to look into. I don't know, I was disappointed almost in some of it, and just kind of, I don't know, felt misled.
The frustrating thing is, I don't disagree with him. Like, I don't disagree that there could be bit-induced fear. I don't disagree that head shaking and a change in bridle, there's probably a connection there. I don't disagree with that. But you can't just make these claims and then not do the actual research. You can't just write a fancy letter and be like, fact. You actually need to establish an experiment. You need to establish parameters and controls, and you need to run an experiment and prove it. Like, that's what the world needs, so that we can all go, oh, we should change. But just a bunch of angry letters to the editor.
Right. And I expected something different. I expected that with how often he's referenced, with how frequently he's referred back to, I would have expected that he had done something or like put forth a scientific study that had controlled variables and changed that variable and wasn't necessarily all conjecture like hypotheses anymore. I expected that he had gone into it and done some experiments, done a few different trials to get different results. But from what I could tell, the biggest thing that he was referring back to was his surveys, which are a great starting point, but I don't know if that's necessarily your end point. I think they're a leaping off point, and then you have like 10 more steps after that.
I think the surveys are a great starting point, but we've talked about the other experiments that open the umbrella and then measured the horse's cortisol levels. Like, you could do that, minus the umbrella. Like, you could like measure heart rate, you could measure their stress hormones, you could set a parameter for behaviors that you were looking at and how many times did the horse do this behavior. Or you could set up, I think the surveys are great, saying that look how many people are interested in this, look how many people do want this. Like, it's got a successful business, he's got a successful product, he has brought bitlessness to a huge population, but I just don't think he's done the work to get bitlessness mainstream or legally allowed to show in. I don't get that.
Yeah, and I also was running into the issue of there are parts of his research, or like not necessarily research, I guess, but parts of what he hypothesizes and like his theories on what bits are causing that I totally agree with. I mean, when he was looking into the issues that bits cause and how they affect the horse's swallowing and how that affects their soft palate, it can affect their throat development and it affects these different parts in their body. I 100% understand that and can agree with that. And now that I've looked into other people's research that actually looked at that, it makes sense. And it all adds up to being like, yes, that is something that bits are causing. But it's hard because he sprinkles like those little tidbits in between a ton of fluff and like outrageous claims. One of the ones I ran into was him listing 22 different diseases caused by bits, and he leads in the initial statement right away. He says these are 22 diseases caused by bits, and then later he amends that like, well, actually 5 of these 22 have flimsy evidence to support that they are caused by bits, and on top of this 5 you have like another 7 that are actually just an extension off of his original 10. And like one of his that he was claiming that is caused by bits is rhabdomyolysis, which is tying up.
Oh, which is,
No, no, I don't think so. Which tying up is a metabolic disease that has a few different causes for it, none of which are caused by the bit. But his statement was that the pain caused, like the oral pain caused by the bit, leads to these muscle cramps and that this is causing tying up. And I was like, I know.
Yeah, and this is the hard thing. Like, there is a difference between correlation and causation. Those are like two different things. Do more horses that are ridden in bits tie up than those that are ridden bitless? That's a hypothesis that you could probably find the answer to be true. But, like, maybe that's because people who ride bitless walk their horses a lot more and aren't barrel racers or aren't, like, out there training super hard with their horses. Maybe bitless people do more trail riding. Therefore, they don't have this sort of, like metabolic disorder occurring with their horses.
Right, and that led me down my own rabbit hole of looking into what causes tying up. And it's like, what causes tying up is genetics that can be triggered by calcium regulatory system malfunction, or PSSM, which is like abnormal sugar levels in the horse's body and like skeletal muscles. It's not because of the bit. Like, that was the biggest part. I was like, I don't know how you can, so many of his like 100+ problems caused by the bit. Okay, well, are some of these also tying up? And like, how many of it is the same thing, but someone just stated it in a different way and he counts that as like another problem caused by the bit?
Well, and it's also hard. Like, you can say bucking is caused by the bit, but like bucking could also not be caused by the bit. Like, it just depends on what was happening in that moment.
And his falls, like him comparing horse and rider falls is caused by the bit. One of the things I read, so like he starts it off with like a grain of truth. The one was that the bit, because it interferes with the horse's breathing, which makes sense. It, causes them to become fatigued quicker because it interrupts their respiratory system. Makes sense. But then he says fatigue causes carelessness and causes a lack of performance. Therefore, it leads to horses' falls. And these falls can be fatal to both horse and rider. Therefore, the bit is fatal to both horse and rider. And I was like, okay, don't know if that's how that works.
I mean, that is an interesting question, though. Like, I would love to know with these falls, what is the tack fit situation? What is the bit situation? I would just love to have that on a chart kind of situation. But I don't know that there is a connection there other than
I think both of us are very much so coming around the idea of, I don't know if I necessarily need to be using a bit on my horse anymore. And I'm questioning, why I use a bit and stuff. But I'm not questioning it because of his research. I'm not questioning it because of...
Yeah, I wouldn't rely on his research to be the thing that persuades someone one way or the other. I think his research there, and if you have time, read it. Otherwise, I wouldn't put too much stock into it. Speaking of the list of many, many diseases that Robert Cook believes that the bit triggers, let's talk about head shakers.
Okay.
First off, I cannot take away from the fact that he did a lot of research, a lot of clinical observations, a lot of work in the late 70s, I believe 1979. In 1980, he published a 4-part series in a veterinary journal. I don't remember the name of the veterinary journal. I could not find it anywhere. I looked so hard for it. It's not publicly available anywhere. It's only referenced.
Okay, so you were having a hard time finding these things too. I thought it was just me.
No, I had a hard time finding some of his earlier stuff, but I think that's just because it was all printed and it wasn't it's not kept online. If you're looking for something from the 60s and 70s, I'm sure that is cataloged physically somewhere and it just hasn't been cataloged online. So I did look for his original work into head shakers because he is referenced in even a lot of current stuff. Actually, I would say he's been referenced as a head shaking expert. That's such a weird term. He's a head shaking expert. He was referenced up until the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s as an expert. As time has progressed, there's been a little bit more research into the disease, and so they've moved beyond his original findings. I did find the first time he talked about bitlessness was in conjunction with head shakers, and this was in a veterinary journal, British Veterinary Association. It was a series of letters published between February and June 1998. So just letters, basically letters to the editors, and they start with this. So I think what had happened was Daniel Mills and Richard Gehring had published their interest in doing a study in a previous journal in I think 1997, the year prior, their interest in studying head shaking and doing a survey, and basically they had set up the parameters for the experiment they wanted to do. Robert Cook writes to the editor, "Sir, I wish to applaud the initiative of Daniel Mills and Richard Gehring at the Behavior Clinic of de Montfort University in Lincoln, and launching a survey on head shaking in horses. One of the etiological factors they might consider, I suggest, is the part played in this frustrating problem by the bit. The survey provides an opportunity for testing a relatively unexplored hypothesis, so explore it, sir, that head shaking may often be caused by the bit." Then he goes on, I just have some bullet points from the letter, that 3 horses I have observed recently that were head shakers when ridden in a traditional bitted bridle behaved normally when ridden in a newly developed bitless bridle, one that incorporates a crossover design. But no explanation is provided as to what does normal look like, what did head shaking look like no additional information, just that they were better. In addition, improvements in performance were observed when this bridle was used on a difficult horse that were not head shakers. Again, please define difficult. What does that mean? What is going on? That's not scientific. Even apparently trouble-free horses that were not recognized as having any aversions to the bit showed an improvement in balance and gait. Again, where is your evidence, sir? I don't know. He then spends the rest of the letter basically explaining all the negative effects of the bit that they can have on a horse, but never really brings it back to head shaking. He just lists off, slowing and stopping is achieved by caudal traction on the lips and jaw, which apart from opening the mouth, something which is itself can be a source of trouble at speed, causes pole flexion, obstructs the nasopharyngeal airway, and reduces the supply of oxygen. That's the whole breathing issue. The bits, yes, they rub, they get traction on the lips and the jaw, can cause issues. Collectively, the lips and mouth and tongue are some of the most neurologically sensitive regions of the body. No human athlete would appreciate being controlled orally or by any method that interfered with their ability to breathe. Neither would human athletes be able to develop the freedom of movement so critical for top performance in their neck muscles, were locked up in a sort of brace that results when a horse resists traction on the bit. So this is something that he does keep mentioning in almost every single letter to the editor and research letter he writes is that bits cause hyperflexion. I don't think that's true. I don't think bits cause hyperflexion. But sir, you're like, let's talk about hyperflexion. Like, I think this is something I found really frustrating with his research is that bits is one part, but I think what's actually maybe the bigger issue is hyperflexion leading to a lot of these issues that he's talking about, and that closing of that throat angle leads to a lot of these breathing issues as well. Just showing out like a human athlete wouldn't appreciate being controlled orally. No, but like, it's one of those things like because bits have been used so long in such a tradition, you're gonna have to do more than like people wouldn't want that. Like you've got to bring something better to the table than that.
That one's frustrating. I also got frustrated with him that whenever someone would say they didn't receive like immediate results with the bitless bridle, or they say they didn't really see a change in their horse, his immediate reaction and response was, well, I'm sorry, but then that's the rider's error. Like he never said anything that it could possibly be caused by like maybe your horse will respond to a different bitless bridle better, or maybe there's like something else going on. His only response when people would have issues with the bitless bridle was, well, then that's rider error.
That's just as bogus of an argument as like people don't want a bit in their mouth. Like it's, it could totally be rider error. It could also totally not be the bit. Like it's just so frustrating. He kind of brings this letter back to head shaking, and he says that head shaking is a sign of confusion or frustration, and then explains why his bridle is better. So the gentleman who received, quote, this letter was written to, does kind of like basically comes back with, that's a great point, but crossover bridles, the way the pressure set up is too confusing to the horses, and horses move into pressure, and it basically like dissolves into them like tit for tat. Do horses move into pressure or away from pressure? And just like, does this bit work, not work? It's like, we all started with head shaking, like how this isn't the conversation I thought was on head shaking. So let's talk about head shaking for just a second, about what it actually is, because I think it's really important to understand what head shaking is so you can kind of understand why a bitless bridle, like a change in bridle, is not going to help you any. So first off, head shaking syndrome is really rare. It's not very common, and because it's not very common, there's not a ton of funding for research. But head shaking is different. If a horse has head shaking, the disease, it is not the same as, I don't know, like head tossing, or like it looks very different. It's a very quick motion where the horse throws its nose up really quickly and brings its head straight back down. It usually, like, it doesn't involve side to side motion. It's an up down. It's very quick. It's very fast. It's triggered by something very specific. So it is essentially what's happening is the horses are getting a feeling in what's called their trigeminal nerve, which runs basically adjacent to their sinuses, and they're feeling something in that trigeminal nerve, like it's being triggered. And this is either being triggered by bright light, the sun, or they're not sure what the other trigger is. There is some belief that maybe it's triggered by, like, it's a type of allergy, because it is more common horses to be seasonal head shakers, having it happen in the spring and the summer. But that could also be the horses that have the light trigger, because it's sunnier in the spring and summer. Not really sure. But the current research is really kind of, that's where the focus is, that the true head shaker syndrome is this nerve that is basically, it feels like maybe it's being pinched or something for the in the horse's face, and the nerve runs from their eye all the way down to their nose, so adjacent to their sinuses. Basically, current treatments include anti-inflammatory medicine, had some success with doing nerve blocks to the nerve, as well as some horses, those goggles, those horsey goggles will help because it limits the light that's coming to their eyes. Though, the science isn't quite sure if the goggles actually help. But that is apparently one reason you can wear those goggles. Bringing it back to the cross-under bridle, if the cross-under bridle is, how could the cross-under bridle affect the amount of light that's being triggered for this horse? The bridle has no effect on the amount of light that's hitting the horse's face. So other causes that could be occurring is if there's pressure on that nerve. It could also be due to teeth problems. So it may not be that your horse has true head shakers, but that nerve is getting pressure because they have teeth problems. And I don't know, does bitless versus not bitless? Well, I understand that the bit doesn't sit on the teeth. Is there could that be a connection there, that having something in the mouth is more irritating to that nerve than outside of the mouth?
I was like, there's another question to ask with head shakers is when you look at where the trigeminal nerve is on like a nerve map of the horse's face, very often traditional bridles are putting pressure on that nerve up near the horse's eye. I would wonder, is it triggered by the same type of like the quantum bridle, anatomical bridle that really goes wide around that nerve and avoids putting pressure on it? Is their head shaker syndrome triggered by that as well? And so I think that's another avenue to express, but just saying it's the bit.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that like it could, we know for sure that a proportion of the horses with head shakers, the true head shakers disease, that it's triggered by light. That doesn't seem like it could be triggered by the bit. So there could be other reasons, absolutely, that the trigeminal nerve is getting pressure on it. As my like understanding of horses that toss their head and shake their head, maybe not traditional, not the like up and down head shakers disease, but a horse that just does a lot of head motion and tossing, to me, that was always a bridle fit sign. Like that was your bridle doesn't fit, your brow band's pinching, the crown piece. Like Addie shakes her head every time I take the bridle off because she does not like the crown pieces that push up into her ears. I know I need to buy the mare a new bridle, but I only ride her once in a blue moon. So it's a lot of money to spend on a fancy bridle for a horse I can't ride. But like, I get it. She wants it. She's told me. So like, I do think that you absolutely can put a different bridle on and see signs, but like it's not how head shakers work. So I don't know.
It's hard because there's so many issues I think he's pointing out in his research that are valid, but then he wants to relate everything back and blame it on the bit. And I just don't know if it's necessarily always the case. Maybe that's one portion or one factor in what causes these issues. And there's definitely certain things like how it impacts a horse's respiratory system that it is a leading cause in that. But there's other things like when he was listening to the diseases, one of the diseases he lists is foaming at the mouth or a scared or hot horse. And I'm like, I don't think that necessarily the sole cause of that is the bit.
Yeah, well, and that's why I say like, well, then go back to, I think that a lot of that could be caused by the head angle. If you have closed up that throat, as we've talked in our previous episode about foaming at the mouth, a horse that's foaming is unable to swallow. A horse should be able to swallow all the saliva they produce. So I do think there's a connection there, but I think it's a little bit broader than just the bit.
Was that all his research into head shakers? Sorry, I know I'm bouncing all over the place.
No, so he did do a huge 5-part big thing in the 70s. Actually, it was 4 parts in the 70s and then a 5th part later in the 90s. I just couldn't find it. I tried really hard to find it. And he does bring it back. I did find it referenced in a different study that someone else wrote about him that talks about head tossing and stumbling. So this comes from, titled Who Needs a Bit, and was published in Natural Horse in 2001. And it was written with the help of Dr. Cook, but the magazine published it underneath their name. But Dr. Cook helped, I don't know. They write, head tossing, stumbling, for example, can be explained as a central response to severe shooting pains originating in the mandibular branch of the nerve. The head rubbing, sneezing, and snorting are signs compatible with pins and needles, or frank pain, referred from the mandibular to the maxillar branch, which supplies sensation to the face and nostrils. Finally, the rapid blinking and sensitive to bright light is consistent with pain, referred from the mandibular and the ophthalmic branch. Unlike the competing hypothesis of allergies and light-related head shaking, however, the trigeminal neurology hypothesis is easy to test. Remove the bit should significantly alleviate or banish the symptoms. Happily, Dr. Cook reports that such is the case and that removal of the bit is the most rewarding treatment he has yet discovered for his I've never even seen this word. It's maybe a typo, it's maybe not. Recalcitrant problem. Removal of the bit should, in his opinion, be the first step in clinical work up on these cases. The validity of a tentative diagnosis of bit-induced trigeminal neurology can, he says, be judged by rewarding responses to the elimination of the bit. One of the things that sticks out to me, right, is that the light, right, so we talked about that it is known that light triggers the head shaking in some of these horses. He says, well, that's just their eyes watering from the pain of the bit. But these horses are also head shakers out in their pasture. Riding, it happens well under saddle and when they're out loose in the pasture. So, but yeah, he's basically trying to debunk the current beliefs. And this was in 2001. And so in 2001, looking at the research around head shakers, they were still referencing his work. And they were recognizing that it was caused by light. Where we are 20 years later is we're much firmer on this. This is no longer quite an hypothesis of allergies and light-related head shaking. We are quite a bit firmer on it. The problem is we don't know how to treat it because it's not responding to a lot of the treatments that we thought or scientists thought would work. They thought allergy medicine would work. No allergy medicine seemed to work. And so now they're doing like nerve blocks and things. They thought the sunglasses would work, and the sunglasses only kind of work. So, can you hear the cat?
Yeah.
Welcome to my hell. But Dr. Cook is wrong. Like, that is at the end of the day. Like, it's really frustrating because a lot of the research he does, like you mentioned, he sprinkles in information. He was for a long time the leader on a lot of this research. He does fully understand. He is the ear, nose, throat guy. He's the guy you wanted for so long. And then something happened and he is obsessed with this bitlessness. And I don't know. I thought like he had some traumatic incident or his wife left him for a bit maker. Like, that has to be it. Like, she broke up with him and his wife is now with the, like, I don't know, this Hermspringer man or like Myler. I don't know. But like that's the only thing that makes sense to me because it was just so sudden, like, boom, it happened. And I don't understand what it was that triggered this. Like, he walked away from science in order to promote bitlessness and this product that he had.
Right. And he, like, his later articles and his later letters that he writes have such strong language in them. And it just makes his biases that much more obvious and makes it so much harder to read what he's writing because it doesn't give you the chance to actually digest the information and produce your own opinion. He's like force feeding you his opinion, and that his opinion is the only opinion. And that anyone that like has something that contradicts his or that introduces maybe a potentially different point or a different avenue to look at it, he'll like write another article or another letter that's in rebuttal to what they said and just always refers back to his previous like studies that he's done or his surveys that he's taken.
Yeah, and so another example of that bias. So this is a paragraph or a summary. He's done this exact like study, quote, quote, study a couple times. So this comes from that Natural Horse magazine, The Natural Horse in 2001. Also, they did like a big summary of all Dr. Cook's research up until that point. And so one of them was bone spurs. I don't know if you looked into this at all, but he does have research around bone spurs that are prevalent in the interdental space in the horse's mouth, so where the bit would go. And his belief is that these bone spurs are triggered by the bit smashing and being used roughly, or maybe not even roughly, I don't know, maybe he just sitting there triggers the bone spurs in the horse's mouth. And he does have photographic evidence of these bone spurs. However, well, I think the biggest number I saw was 60. He has looked at 60 horse heads to confirm the presence of these bone spurs. Did you see whose horse heads he was looking at? Because I think this is a little bit biased.
I don't know if I exactly remember, but I was reading something that talked about the 60 horses, and part of them were feral horses that never had a bit in their mouth, and then the others were adult zebras.
Yes. Hang on for a second, because I think the way he set up this experiment is okay. And I'm not going to disagree. I think his experiment is correct. It is bit-caused bone spurs and bit-caused dental issues. You know what? I don't disagree with that. I disagree with how you got there. So these were all horses from the Natural History Museum, Smithsonian, and the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. Dr. Cook surveyed 48 skulls from horses that were 5 years old or older for evidence of bone spurs on the mandible caused by the bit. He compared these with 20 mature zebra skulls. None of the zebra skulls showed any abnormalities of bone in the bony bars of the mouth. He also looked at 5 Przewalski horses that had died in the National Zoological Park and 8 feral horses from Asatiga also show no abnormalities.
You doing okay, buddy?
It's water infused with iron. Maybe it's the iron. Oh my gosh, it's the iron. It's bad for you. It's gone straight to the head. That's another thing. Bit can't pronounce words. Have you ever seen a horse pronounce a word correctly? No. Never have. Anyways, so those horses, the 48 skulls, and he eventually got up to 60 skulls of horses from museums that had bone spurs in their mouth, including the famous thoroughbred racehorse Lexington, who was one of those that had bone spurs present. So he found that 74% of the horses had bone spurs in their mouths, the domesticated horses over the age of 5. So I was like, who's Lexington? I ain't never heard of him. I don't know much about racehorses, but like, cool, Lexington. What's he about? When do you think Lexington died?
I don't know. If he's in a museum, it was a long time ago.
Lexington died in 1875.
Oh my God, so much has changed since then. Does he know that?
So much has changed! I'm sorry, I yelled into the mic. Okay, a little bit of rage. You work at a veterinarian clinic. X-ray the horses that come in. It can't be that much.
I assume maybe once a month they have to euthanize a horse or something. Or maybe it's more frequently than that.
Oh, it's way more frequent than that. You have dozens and dozens of horses sitting in your university, whether it's the hospital, whether it's experiments. Like, why did you choose museum horses? Because they had the scariest bits in their mouth? Yes, most of us don't use the bits from 1875 anymore. We agree that those things are scary. But that's when you're coming up with dental damage and bone spurs? Like, sir, I don't disagree with you. I just disagree with horses that died in 1875 as being the example for 2020.
And it'd be even more interesting if he looked into those in racing and their level of bone spurs compared to those in dressage or ponies in school programs or those that are ridden bitless. Like, it'd be so much more interesting that way than looking at horses in a museum and comparing them to zebras.
And I like that. And that's the issue with his research is like, I've seen the patents for the bits that were around in 1875, and a lot of them weren't pleasant looking. But those are the heads I would expect to see damage. Like, those are the heads I would expect to see it. Have you seen the spurs they used back then, too? I wouldn't use those spurs on my horse. My horse doesn't like spurs, so I wouldn't use any spurs. But, like, the point is we've come a long way. You cannot compare. That's not fair. And that's not, thanks for doing an experiment and doing some research. We just would have loved to have seen that done on recent horses.
He does this research that is like it's designed to be skewed in his favor. Like, he specifically goes out to do these experiments or look at with his like surveys and the questions he asks of those that use his bridle. It's almost like he specifically designs it and only seeks information that's gonna confirm what he already has theories about. And he does this in his, like, when I watched how he responded to people that criticized or didn't necessarily agree with his bitless bridle, he was so quick to agree and support those who claimed like ailments caused by their bit, and they were in favor of his bridle no matter what their background was, no matter who they were, if they were a little kid, if they were an amateur adult. So quick to agree with them, and then immediately on a dime turns around and dismisses every single person that doesn't necessarily agree with him. And like, his immediately first reaction is, well, you're not a vet, so you have no basis to stand on.
Well, and that's so frustrating because like, we do recognize that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the mouth and the horse's head. I recognize you're a vet and you know what you're talking about. It's just like that 22-page bibliography I sent you. A good chunk of that was authors and other researchers who had referenced his work favorably. He did not include anyone that disagreed with his work. And I'd be curious to know, like, how long that list is. You know, how many people and who are they from?
He did include his rebuttals of where he was like, well, this is why you're wrong. This is another reason why you're wrong. And you're like, okay.
Yes. So that letter I was reading from, that was supposedly a 4-letter series. So he got 2 letters and that guy got 2 letters. I could not find the other guy's conclusion letter. I could only find the middle letter where he responded to it. But I couldn't find the like final letter because it's hard to find a lot of these stuff. He's only a lot of this research we absolutely got off of his website because that's where it's available that's where you get most of it, because it's just too hard to find in these older journals. It's either just not available online, or if it is available, you have to pay a lot of money, and I didn't want to pay a lot of money. So the big gist with his research is it's not research. What he was doing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was research. He was studying, he was reporting on his clinical observations, but I never saw one time where he set up an experiment ever no matter, even in the 70s, I didn't see any experiments he ever set up. It was all just his findings. And I think that kind of speaks to maybe his personality a little bit, that he always spoke from a place of authority, or always spoke as if he was the foremost expert. Never once conducted an experiment, let alone found results unfavorable to his opinion. Even when he was looking at stuff from the 60s and 70s and 80s, even in that time period, prior to whatever triggered the bit issue. And I just think it's really weird that why have you not set up a single experiment, like actually, or try to work with another university? Like, what I'd be really curious is, like, what are your students? Like, you've been a professor for so long. I'm sure your opinion has not been hidden from your students. What do your students think? Like, what are their thesis papers on? Like, I want to know what your students, like, what their thesis is, what they were researching, what they were doing underneath you. Because I'd be curious to know if they...
That'd be so cool to read their, like, dissertations and stuff and read what they're writing about.
Yeah, I would be very interested in their dissertations. I wouldn't use this in an argument with your friends if you're trying to convince them to switch to bitless, because it's just, ain't a good look. Just really ain't a good look at the end of the day.
Right. I'm in favor of bitless, but I'm not in favor of a lot of what he was writing.
Yeah, it just has such a strong bias. And I mean, and one of his papers, I think is probably the best word for it, was called Accident Prevention. And he does this whole thing about blaming the bit, the saddle, and the horseshoes for rotational falls on cross country. And basically, like, he opens up with, like, one of these things is what injured Christopher Reeves. Well, that's a big statement to make. Also, I didn't know Christopher Reeves was an inventor. I thought Christopher Reeves was one of those, like, 100-jumper famous people. He did 3-day eventing. Go Christopher Reeves. But, like, I don't disagree that a poor fitting saddle could be the cause of a refusal. It's just big statement to make with no follow-up, no fact. Next week's episode, we're going to dive into the pain factor. We're going to try to look at pain from both the Hackmore and the bit, try to compare these two. Is there a better option here if we're talking straight up pain? We're going to avoid using Dr. Cook's research as we move forward because we've talked about it. We're good. We don't need it. There's actual scientific information on this topic. But I do kind of want to, like, one of the things I've been really struggling with this week, and I want our listeners to think about this for the next week. How does the bit work? Like, that is just, like, I have been pondering this question all week. It's like, most of the time when we train our horses, we teach them to move away from pressure. We don't do that with the bit. What are we teaching them? Like, I don't understand the bit. I'm so sorry. Like, that sounds like I'm a dumb child who doesn't, like, understand how horses work. But I've, like researching this. How does the bit work? How is it communicating with the horse? Why do they pay such good attention to it? Like, I don't disagree. My horse is a little bit duller in a Hackmore. But why?
Like, I don't disagree that when I'm riding in a halter or something, or so far, I haven't been able to find a way to, like, get the same level of engagement that I feel with the bit in a halter. I haven't tried in a bitless bridle, which I would love to try, but I've been struggling with kind of like the same thing, the same ideas, is trying to, like, switch over to this mindset or, like, learning more about it. Is I'm so resistant to it because one of my things I always said was, like, I use a bit because it offers me more aids. You know, it helps me teach my horse to do dressage movements better. I have more aids available, more cues to signal different movements and stuff. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, I used that blatant statement, but what were the aids I was looking for? What was the aid that I think I'm getting from my bit that I think I wouldn't be able to obtain with the bitless option?
Yeah, because, I mean, the follow-up to that is you're going to hear is, well, the bit works because you're using your seat and your legs and, you know, all these other cues, and then your hands and the bit are just secondary. But, like, that's not what I'm asking. Like, I understand how my body works. I understand how my leg aids work. I'm asking about the bit specifically. What does the bit specifically do? What are those aids? Like, what? I recognize that there's a difference between when my horse rides bitless and in a bit. But, like, why? What is that? Like, I just don't. How does it work? How is that bit communicating with the horse what to do? I don't get it.
I'm so glad we're doing the research into this and, like, forming our own opinions and, like, looking at all these different people, including Dr. Cook's studies. I myself, like, I still right now, even after we did the first part of the bit series and we learned about how, like, it impacts their breathing and their respiratory system, I'm still like, well, I could use a bit and, like, not do high like heavy exercise and it'd be fine. It wouldn't be impacting their breathing. But like I am still so resistant to just transitioning over to bitless because one, you're not allowed to in recognized competitions and stuff. And two, okay, I transitioned over to bitless. Now what?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're there because I'm on the other side of that fence. I have ripped all my bits off. They are burning. Like, it's like throwing my bits out and just lighting them on fire. Like, I'm done, girl. I ain't need another bit ever again. I don't know why I sounded like that. I'm sorry. I just don't need it. Like, I don't need it. I'm good. Don't want it in my life anymore. I'm going to figure out how to make this bitless thing work, but there's definitely a learning curve. Like it's not the same. And as we said in the last bitless episode, or no, maybe it was just last week's, I don't know. We said it at some point in time. You know, when you pick up a dressage manual or, you pick up a book, they're all talking about how to feel and ride and get timing in a bit. No one's talking about what does it feel like in a bitless bridle? What does on the bit on Hackmore feel like? I don't know, on the noseband. That's cute. On the noseband. So that is like, it's kind of a no man's land out here. You got to figure it out.
Right. And I know I'm resistant to it. I am like so resistant to switching my mindset over to being like strictly bitless. I'm very much so in between the two. I don't know why I'm resistant to it. I just am.
Because it's tradition. Why would you? This is what we've been using for so long. This is the like tool. This is a communication tool. You wear your helmet. For those of us who wear helmets, you put your bit on. Like it's a saddle. Sorry, for me, like a helmet. I just like my helmet's like a go-to. I wouldn't.
I always put my helmet on. It's not something I question.
Right, and I feel like the bit's the same way. That was like what I was trying to make. That was the comparison. It's like for those of us who wear helmets, it's you grab your helmet, you put it on every day, even if you're like just gonna putz around bareback on your pony for 5 minutes. Like you put it on, and that's how bits are. Everyone uses bits. Like you're the crazy one for not wanting to use a bit.
I don't know. I hope other people are like where I am at right now and that I'm not the only one just hanging out in no man's land, lost as can be, slowly wandering around trying to figure out what I'm going to do next.
There's plenty of people.
Perfect. Just what the world needs. More me. I guess on that note, guys, thank you so much for sticking with us. Hopefully you like part 2 of the to-bit or not to-bit debate, as well as hope you tune in next week for part 3, where we look at the paint aspect of bits and I don't know what else they're doing to our horses and helping figure out where you fall in the line, as well as like where we're falling on the line with bits and no bits. But if you guys want to reach out to us, if you have questions, comments, concerns, you can reach out to us on Instagram at inthebarn.pod. Stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle.
Bye.